Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to our inaugural program, a public forum on petro diplomacy, the political economy of volatile oil prices. To explore this topic in depth, we held two working group sessions today, and with 8 speakers, really addressed the impact on both the consumers, the producers, as well as the political implications. This afternoon's panel of distinguished speakers will present you with a summary of the two working groups that we had today and welcome your comments and questions. As I said, this is our inaugural program, and it's a very important day for me and certainly for the team of the Arab Gulf States Institute, because it comes after almost just a little over a year of establishing this institution to finally get to open our doors and welcome a public audience for our first program. And before the year, of course, there were at least 2 years in the planning and feasibility studies to make sure that this think tank could be both viable and also contribute to the discussion and the dialogue in Washington. Our programs and policy papers will focus on a broad range of topics, from politics and security to economics and trade, as well as cultural and social trends. Thank you for attending, and I want to turn it over to Steve Seche, our Executive Vice President, who will moderate this afternoon's session.
Great, thanks very much, Marcel. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you this afternoon, and I think that perhaps our distinguished panel is only exceeded by our distinguished audience. So for everyone who's come out this afternoon, as Marcel said, our first chance to open our doors publicly to you all, and we hope we'll have you back on many occasions in the future. You're all trailblazers now, so please let your grandchildren know that you were here on day one. And it's going to be a very important moment. It's a milestone for all of us, and especially for our panelists who have been really heroic, I think, in the course of a long day, exchanging ideas and thoughts and theories about a very interesting and important subject, the volatility of global energy markets and implications for the political and economic well-being of both the United States and our Gulf allies. And I think it's just reinforced for me the centrality of this issue to the stability of our country and the states in the Arab Gulf, and that is, of course, our focus. What we'll do this afternoon, to begin, as Marcel said, is kind of ask our panelists to reprise a bit their findings, their positions that they articulated in the course of the 2 smaller sessions, and then we'll take as many questions as we can get before our 6 o'clock shutdown time. I've asked our 2 moderators of the sessions to open up with a quick summary, and then we'll turn to their panelists. But let me introduce this very distinguished group of panelists we have here before we get started. To my left, my immediate left, is Ambassador Frank G. Wisner, the International Affairs Advisor at Squire Patton Boggs, and purely coincidentally, the chairman of our board of directors. Next to Ambassador Wisner is Kamel Al-Harami. Kamel was the president, or now he's the ex-president of Kuwait Petroleum International, and he is an independent energy analyst. Then we have Kate Dourian. To Kamel's left, Kate is a senior editor at the Middle East Economic Survey. I'm trying to see who's next. Oh, there's Roger. We have Roger Diwan next to Kate, who's the vice president at IHS Financial Services. It must be Jean-François Seznec, who is a visiting associate professor at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. And finally, at the end of the other end of the table is Professor Vinod Aggarwal, the director of the Berkeley Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Study Center at UCLA in Los Angeles, California.
UC Berkeley, sorry.
UC Berkeley in Berkeley, California. That's what isn't that what I meant to say? Thank you so much.
That's just a little rivalry there.
I bet there is, yeah. Go Cal. I'm sorry. In any event, we'll open with Kate, and Kate will give us a bit of an overview on the first session, and then she will turn to the 3 morning panelists for some additional thoughts, and then we'll go on to the afternoon and then go on to questions. So please, Kate, if you would.
Yes, it was we had so much in the first and second sessions that it's going to be really hard to summarize it. But I started off by saying that, you know, when my son was 8 years old, I took him to an OPEC meeting, and Ali Naimi, who was minister then and is minister now, he's been around for over 2 decades, the Saudi Arabian minister, my son, totally unprompted, went up to him and he said, are you going to change the price of oil? And And he later took a photograph of himself with Ali and Amy wearing a suit to school in Dubai at the American school. And he said, "Mummy, people don't believe me that this is a very important man, that this is a Saudi Arabian oil minister. He's not wearing the Arab garb, you know, So, and I said it's an example of the stereotype. You know, even in Dubai at the American school, there was a stereotype of the Arab oil man. And also the fact that at that time, Ali Naimi was seen as somebody who could move prices as a sort of the biggest producer in OPEC. And what we debated today was whether OPEC is still relevant in view of the tremendous growth in shale. We discussed the fact that the break-even price for shale production is going down, productivity is higher, the days that it takes to drill wells is getting shorter. So even though we're seeing a slowdown in growth, we've seen tremendous growth between 2009 and 2014. I think the numbers we saw earlier were 6.5 million barrels of growth total, of which 4.8 million barrels was from the US and only 600,000 from the OPEC states. So I think we were talking about price volatility. I argued at first that we hadn't seen the type of volatility that we saw back in earlier decades when you would see really huge price movements. But we are seeing volatility. You're right. We were seeing volatility. We've seen prices go down to 43. They've gone up to 65 now, around that range. But they're still within a range of 45 to 65. And how that's impacting the relationship between the United States and the GCC countries. Are they still relevant? Are we still committed to a relationship with the GCC countries? Are they still relevant? Is OPEC necessary? Who is the swing producer? Is it the United States? Is it Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia has officially relinquished its role as swing producer. How does that impact the sort of global supply-demand fundamentals, and what impact is it going to have on the future? If prices stay as low as they are at the moment, is that going to have an impact on future investment? Are we going to see a supply shock sometime in the future? So all of this was debated. And one thing that came out, which I found was very interesting, is we saw a chart of people trying to predict prices. And I think we had a number of banks, intergovernmental institutions, NGOs, and none of them got it right. So I think trying to plan a future industry when you have so many variables, when you have geopolitical concerns in the Middle East that don't seem to impact prices. So it shows you that the market is very well supplied. And I think somebody gave a number of the fact that there is 1.6% oversupply in the market, but that had resulted in a 50% drop in oil prices. So we are seeing that kind of volatility with very, very small numbers. And I think that makes it really difficult for oil companies to plan ahead for the future, for both national oil companies and international oil companies. And then we moved on to the politics and the geopolitics and whether this is an actual policy, what role Saudi Arabia plays, but I'll leave that to Vinny later on. So I would like to hear from Kamel the GCC view of where we stand at the moment, given that are we still relevant as GCC producers?
Let me put the microphone closer to Kamel
Thank you.
for purposes of
Sorry,
the conversation.
there you go.
Okay, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it is today I was surrounded by shale oil producers, analysts, financial institution, and I've known in the Arab world that I always give them bad news, but today the speaker they gave me worse news, and I really don't know how to convey it back home. That the shale is here to stay, to increase, and there is going to be a reduction in shale oil production cost. And this is a real challenge for us, for the Gulf states, for the Gulf oil producers. And how are we going to face it? it is a reality. And people back home, they are still optimistic that, okay, fine, oil prices will go up, and we have enough cash, we have enough liquidity to manage. But the fact of the matter is not there. Of course, we had a reduction of oil prices by 50% or more. But are we doing anything about it? That's the crunch of the matter. And what are we going to do about it? We have an oil price reduction, but in the meantime, we see our governments are giving more aids to our neighboring countries, to our friends, to other parts of the world. So what message are we passing to the ordinary people? Are we going to tell them to tighten their belt, but then we're giving more aid? Are we going to give them, tell them, no, you reduce your consumption, rational your consumption of electricity, of gasoline? Well, as we are the most countries in the world that increasing our oil consumption and the electricity, how are we going to tackle the issue that when we go on holiday, and I'm sorry to say that, but it's a reality, we're going on holiday, but we have our central air condition on while we're spending our holiday, whether it's in Egypt or in the Arab world or in London or in America. So we're getting different messages. I come from Kuwait, but then, okay, fine. But then we were rewarded by the United Nations as we are the best country of giving aids to the world. Are we really being realistic that we're facing a price reduction and we are unable to do anything? And I set example this morning. We have increased the diesel prices. It's not going to affect anybody, but still people protested, and we have to cancel it. The reduction, the second day. So the reality of the matter is that, are we serious in addressing the issue of oil prices reduction? Now, talking about that, in the meantime, we are facing some challenges. When I say challenges, I'm talking about Kuwait, but that also brings me back because Kuwait is part of the GCC. We have a problem with job opportunities, creating job opportunities. We have a small population. We have young population. How can we tackle that? Of course, during the past 10 or 15 years, we had cash, mountains of cash. But that amount of cash or that excess cash was not spent in the country. We waited, we gave it, we invested overseas in seven wealth funds, whether it was we invested in America or we invested in Europe or in China or in Japan. But that does not give us job opportunities. That does not create job opportunities. And that's the challenge. We have a young population. The domestic demand on oil is increasing, the waste is increasing, and we have to do something about it. Our population is growing, fine. But then, when you look at the population, the structure of the population needs to be addressed. And how we can address that's the thing, the problem. When we have 4 million citizens in Kuwait, still we are the minority in our country. And that's applicable to most of the GCC country except for maybe Saudi Arabia. These are the challenges that we have to face. Creating job opportunities, facing the future, and then the other thing that is coming now too is that we feel we are a bit unsafe. We don't feel safe, especially if America is going to have a pact with Iran, the nuclear pact, and then Iran will normalize its relationship with America. Then where do we stand? Are we able to stand alone and to defend ourselves? These are the challenges that we are facing. It's not that we are having oil, yes, and we have a plenty of oil, but are we able to manage the oil resources and the energy resources in our country?
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah. We also discussed how the growth in shale was having an impact on markets, on price, on behavior. And Roger, you gave an excellent presentation. If you could tell us.
I think it's important to understand that the oil markets really went through a revolution in the last 12 months, and it's really a fundamental change in the way we look at oil markets for a number of reasons. And obviously, it's been triggered by shale, but I'm not sure people understand the real impact of shale. So I'll try to describe a little bit that and how the industry and then the different players will adapt to it. Oil prices really peaked in June around $117 and declined through the year until November because the market was obviously oversupplied. It was oversupplied because the U.S. growth was accelerating and Libya brought back oil on the market. And during the OPEC meeting at Thanksgiving, suddenly Saudi Arabia said, well, we will not ensure anymore a floor to oil prices, so prices collapsed. And they collapsed because basically by removing itself from the equation, Saudi Arabia said financial markets will now rule the oil market. And financial markets do always the same thing, which is to overshoot. And by removing the floor, you open the flood of money to come and speculate and undermine oil prices, and it's exactly what happened. But to understand why Saudi Arabia came to that conclusion is because they were facing an immediate problem, which is the oversupply of the market, and in the longer term, an undersupply of the oil market. And the only response was to let markets help adjust that. So to understand the oversupply of the market, which was triggered by the shales in the United States, in 2014, the United States added net 1.4 million barrels per day of oil onto the market at a time when global demand was growing around 700,000 barrels per day. So the U.S. alone added twice the global demand growth. And if you count the rest of the world, including Libya, you grew supply at around 2.4 million barrels per day for a demand which was stagnant. So you created 1.5 million or more of oversupplies, I would say 1.5 to 2% of supply growth, which trigger a 50% plus decline in oil prices. And the reason is, oil is difficult to store, it's expensive to store, so a small oversupply, if it's not managed, trigger a very large price movement. So when we say people cannot see these sharp price changes, one is on the margin, they're small changes, they're not very large, and two, because of the financialization of oil, they have tremendous impact. What's important to understand is the magnitude of the change triggered by what we're seeing in the United States, and the shale in particular. We were lucky to have the CEO and chairman of EOG Resources. I don't know if many of you know EOG Resources. We tend to focus on the Exxon and the Chevron of the world. But EOG Resources is really, I would say, the tip of the spear of the revolution. Bill didn't look like a revolutionary, but the slides he put on the board were truly radical. And I think it's probably the most radical thing we witnessed this morning. He was showing the result of his company. And what we're seeing in the shales is oil wells or the ability to produce from these shales, which are really the bottom and the worst part of the resource pyramid, were able to produce 3-4% 3-4 years ago, and now we're able to produce up to 20%. So we increased the resources in the United States almost by tenfold over the last 5 years. It's incredible when you think about the amount of oil that we unleashed. More importantly, we brought down the cost of producing these shales from $100 to maybe $35 or less for the better part of the shale, the core area where EOG mostly operate. He also showed how the productivity has increased. It takes now 4 days to drill a shale well. It took over 20 days 3 years ago. Just for EOG alone this year, the productivity per well has risen almost by 40%. So with the same well bore, you produce 40% more than you did a year ago. Just to give you a sense of the magnitude, when you put all these operators together, I told you that the US grew by 1.4 million barrels per day. I lied to you. The US brought online, just for the wells drilled in 2014, 3.6 million barrels per day. So we added a full Iraq in 1 year of production. Obviously, it's a system which has a very steep decline rate, so we lost 2.4 million barrels per day, which we lost Kuwait. So we added Iraq, we lost Kuwait. It's a good way to think about it. But we're talking here of very large magnitude numbers that we rarely seen in the history of the oil industry. Last year in 2014 was the largest increase any country has ever brought to the oil market in 1 year. So we're not talking about normal times here. And in many ways, that has impacted global supply, and the Saudis came to the conclusion there was no reason to stand in front of that rumbling train and to pull back and allow financial market to adjust. And in a way, by pulling back, this is really what was triggered. It's not OPEC now which is managing the oil markets, it's the capital market in the United States. It's Wall Street. So Wall Street, by its ability to provide or not capital to the oil shale, really managed the oil market for the time being. I don't think it's a permanent state of affairs. It will change, and Saudi Arabia will become relevant again. It's just a matter of time. But it's complete change. So what we monitor right now, more than what Naimi has said and where oil ministers are meeting, we're really constantly monitoring the flow of money and how the banks are redetermining loans or not to the shale producer in the market. That's really what matters. How many rigs are drilling, how many wells are being fracked. Those are much more important determinants right now of oil production than what OPEC is doing. As I said, these lower oil prices trigger responses. The main response right now, lower oil prices, lower availability of capital. So we'll see a pullback in the United States. But more importantly, what we're describing here is a system working at two different speeds. The US system working at a incredibly fast speed. Again, between the moment you decide to drill a well, you drill it, you complete it, you bring it online, it's less than 100 days in the United States. For the global industry, it's an average of 5 years. So think what it means when you're trying to invest in an environment where you have very volatile prices. It means that the United States is the first mover almost always and will determine the shape of the oil market. It also means that the global industry is not going to be able to invest in this environment, and we will likely see lower investment, which will start impact production in year 3, 4, 5 from now, meaning that we will have an undersupply at some time into the near future, and this is where OPEC and Saudi Arabia become relevant again. Saudi Arabia also have to deal with probably 2 more issues in the year to come, which is the return potentially of Iranian barrels and the potential increase from Iraq. And these 2 are fairly large producers, which can add several million barrels in the short term, medium, and long term. So that enters the equation. Finally, there will be winners and losers in the industry who survive that shale revolution. And in particular, I think, again, listening to Bill Thomas this morning, it shows you how adaptable and dynamic the U.S. industry is compared to the world oil and gas industry, and their ability to respond much faster and invest at them and adapt their investment to the changing condition, in a way taking less risk, providing a lot more volume and value actually to their investors. So in many ways, the shale revolution has put the U.S. back at the center strategically, even if we're importing still a lot of oil. It's still a global market, but the oil industry in this country, which was moribund 3 years ago, now is really at the center of attention. I'll stop here.
Thank you. I think that sort of wraps up our session of the morning. But you know what we ended up saying is that we now have a sort of new axis. We have three producers, major producers: Russia, the U.S., and Saudi Arabia, producing roughly the same amount of oil. We sort of discounted the importance of Russia because of sanctions, because of the cost of production, because of various other issues. So it really is down to the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. And I think the next session you will hear about where we see, do we see that this is actually Saudi oil policy? Are we seeing a more assertive foreign policy that is now being reflected also in oil policy? Which came first? We don't really know. The geopolitics, I think we are minimizing. We're looking too much at short-term developments. We're looking at rig counts every Friday. Everybody jumps up and down. Rig count goes up and down. Yes, fine. But, you know, where are these rigs? Which rigs are we... we're not looking at the bigger picture. And I think, you know, when we move from oversupply to undersupply, that's when we might start seeing more impact from geopolitics. But there is also a misunderstanding. I think we heard from Aldo Flores today, who is supposed to be bringing producers and consumers together and various producers to talk to each other. And I think there is a grave misunderstanding of what it takes to produce shale. I think the Saudis don't really understand it. They thought that the break-even price was 80. At first they thought it was 100, then 90, then 80. It keeps going down, and I think there is a lack of understanding, and at some point they're going to have to sit down and say, okay, you know, we need to balance this market. The market is not going to balance itself. You need to have somebody take charge. So.
Great. Thank you very much, Kate, and thanks to our panelists from this morning's session for your summaries of the discussion this morning. I'll now turn to Vinod Aggarwal, who did chair the afternoon session, which looked more into the foreign policy implications of the shale revolution and the volatile global markets. And then we'll come to Ambassador Wisner and to Jean-François Seznec to summarize their presentations, and then we'll go to questions. Please, Vinny.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think an important theme that we discussed in the afternoon is the relationship between domestic political economy and foreign policy. And I think it was widely accepted that you really can't have a successful foreign policy, foreign economic policy, foreign security policy unless you're strong at home domestically. And I think that applies both to the Gulf countries as well as to the United States, and that was a key theme that we discussed. So I'm going to talk about four issues then: the domestic political economy of the Gulf states. That was an important topic of discussion. We've already heard a little bit about that from Mr. Al-Harami. We'll talk a little bit about the U.S. domestic economy, and then we also talked about both the Gulf country foreign economic policy and U.S. foreign policy. So with respect to domestic political economy of the Gulf states, we've heard that there are a lot of inefficiencies in the Gulf countries. I think one figure really stood out in my mind listening, which was that Saudi Arabia used 3.5 million barrels a day, which is the same as India. And of course, Saudi Arabia's population and India are radically different. India has 1.2 billion people, so it's quite striking that level of consumption in a country with a very small population relatively. Another important point that was raised was that there's a lot of focus on production costs. And I think a number of oil analysts worry a lot about whether we're thinking about $10 oil or $12 oil. What's the true cost of oil production? Should we take into account capital costs and the like? And the reality is it's really a budget constraint. And another figure that stood out in my mind was that the break-even point for Saudi Arabia is $103, and that doesn't even include countries like outside the region, such as Venezuela and so on, with some of these break-even points in the $150 range. So that really affects their need for oil, their need to keep pumping, even when the market is low. So I think that's very striking. And the alternative, of course, is to borrow money. This wasn't really discussed, but I might point out I did a lot of work on Latin American debt, and I'm not going to try to relate the Middle East to Latin America, but you know this didn't end well when you borrow a lot of money because you have a lot of oil. I just think of the case of Mexico with Aldo there. I think about '82 crisis, borrowing money and oil prices fell, and we know how that ended very badly. Of course, Saudi Arabia doesn't have that problem. It has huge reserves of $750 billion, so it can just dip into its reserves. But not all countries are as fortunate as Saudi Arabia, which of course will lead to some domestic political instability, both in the Gulf and among other countries. And finally, I think the key issue of diversification is very important. As these countries try to restructure their economies, they become excessively dependent on oil. And this is a story that's very true about almost all oil-producing countries. It's easy to invite in multinationals. It's easy to get the oil out yourself. It's easy to make you dependent, essentially monoculture and monodependent on one commodity, which has some very negative repercussions when oil prices fall, of course. In terms of the U.S. domestic economy, I think there's been a benefit to the U.S. economy from low oil prices. Interest rates are, of course, low. Inflation is low as a result of lower oil prices. And there was a lot of debate about fracking companies and how they're going to survive. We've already heard about the fracking companies. What's striking is how at such a low price they can still break even at $35 or $40 a barrel. And the other point that's quite important is they can get in and out of the market. So, in other words, this notion that they're somehow going to disappear and go away doesn't look like that they're all going to go away. Some will no doubt go away because some are kind of, as was put by somebody, cowboys in the industry. The cowboys kind of go in and out. But all of them are not cowboys, and there's some very major fracking companies that understand the relationship between fracking and managing your budget correctly, and I think that was very important. On the plus side, on the U.S. side, we see that the U.S. has succeeded from a combination of three factors: technology, entrepreneurship, and financial markets. And American financial markets are often criticized, as we heard, overshooting, which is very true, creating their own crises. But in this case, the fact that you have this kind of nice mutually interactive combination of these three factors makes it possible to have this fracking industry and to be very successful in that, which gives the U.S. important leverage. And that's not just true from where I come, the Silicon Valley area, but even in the oil business. Turning to the international side, in terms of the Gulf countries, a lot of debate took place, and we may hear about that very shortly, about what are the true Saudi motivations for not cutting back production. Some argue this was an anti-Russian action, and this is a Saudi strategy to deal with the Russians in some way and their support of various groups the Saudis don't like. Others argue there's really no foreign policy strategy, or that you really can't run all of your foreign policy based on oil. Other participants argue that OPEC, in fact, has never been very successful. That's kind of a myth that OPEC has been successfully able to manage prices, and it looks like a correlation. But as we know, correlation is not causation, so we should not really believe that OPEC has actually been managing prices all this time, even though they probably did that in 1973-74. But after that, it's not obvious that they were able to do that. The issue of Iran's return to normalcy with the nuclear framework agreement is very, very important. I think we'll hear some more about that from Ambassador Wisner and others. And also, how will the U.S. now view the Gulf countries, right? Once it starts normalizing its relations with Iran, will its interest change in the Gulf? With its willingness to support the Gulf as much as it has in the past, change as well in governments in that region. There was also talk about radicalization in the Middle East, and the question was, is it oil that drove it or something else? And I think most people agreed that oil is a factor, but clearly only one factor. And therefore, one needs to really explore more carefully what are the other dynamics driving this problem in the Middle East that has negative externalities for everybody. And lastly, I think there was a good line about that the U.S. may be more creative now in its international diplomacy because it has more leeway, it has more oil production, so this may actually be a game changer. And American foreign policy is often seen to be very slow to move, very anemic, but in fact sometimes these shocks or changes in the domestic political economy or the economic aspects actually affects our security policy. So I think that's another important theme that we would like to explore and talk about further. Thanks.
That's great. Maybe I'll turn to Jean-François at the moment because he's sitting next to you. You can share your microphone with him.
Okay.
And then we'll have Ambassador Wisner kind of wrap it up for us, if you don't mind, Frank. And then we'll go to questions, okay? Great. Thanks, Jean-François. Please.
Sure. Well, what I did this afternoon is I was really focusing on Saudi policy, and there's been some disagreement on whether there is a Saudi policy at all or whether there is no Saudi policy. But I think there is a Saudi policy. I think the disagreement may be on what it is rather than, or why it is, rather than there is one or not. But I believe that there is a Saudi strategy of regaining control of the market. Yes, they've lost them. I mean, I think Roger explained very well that there are only two producers now really that matter in terms of strategy. It's the US and Saudi Arabia, and that the Russians are somewhat bypassed, but they still produce 2.2 million barrels per day. and that's a great deal of oil. Now the thing is, I think the Saudi strategy is very much oriented to and against Russia, because I think the Saudis, to regain their control of the market as they had in the past, need to get somebody to cut production. They know they cannot get the U.S. to cut production because this is done by the companies. The price is at 35 on shale for the new oil, and the U.S. companies will continue to produce. However, the Russians have a lot of very inefficient wells and so on, and they could pretty much cut productions. On top of it, they're really short of technology. They're not getting technology from us anymore because of the sanctions on Ukraine. So their production is declining very slowly, but they could make it decline even faster. And I think the Saudis are targeting the Russians. I'm basing that on the idea that's exactly what Ali Al-Naimi organized in 1999 when he cut the price from 40 to 10. And he got the Russians to cut, and he got the Norwegians to cut, and everything. No one from OPEC cut at that time, but the Saudis worked it out. So I think the Saudis are really targeting not a major, but some cut from Russia. And actually, I think to a certain extent, this is already taking place, and this is why we're seeing the prices inching up very slowly to 65 now. And they may end up going to 80. So I think the problem, though, is that in order to do this, the Saudis have to spend an enormous amount of money. Yes, their budget is, today at $60 per barrel. Their official budget deficit next year, in 2015, will be $39 billion. But that is forgetting one small detail: is $100 billion of defense expenses. $80 billion of defense expenses. If you add that total, the Saudis will be really, and the over budget and so on, they will be out of pocket by $150 billion next year. They only have access to $750 billion only. $750 billion in reserves, cash reserves today, but they also can draw on the money which is kept by the banks, as they did in the past. They can also draw on the money from the general insurance companies, and that's another 130 billion. So they have over $1 trillion to feed this policy, if there is such a case. Now, there is some disagreement here on whether or not there is a policy that Ali Al-Naimi was given a check of $150 billion a year to wage war against Russia. That, we may or may not agree on that, but the fact is, this is a little bit what's happening. Whether it was a decision or not, okay, we can disagree on that. But the fact is, that's what they're doing today. And who is going to give in? Will the Russians give in? They only have $350 billion in cash reserves. They will have to give in. And in my view, they already have given in, and I think we will see the price going down a little bit. The problem I had, and where I don't know where it's going to go, is with the new leadership in Saudi Arabia. I really thought my little idea here was very strong, and I was very pleased with it. But then it turns out that some of my Saudi friends are telling me, yeah, well, maybe, but if Ali Al-Naimi retires, then we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know who's going to be the next minister. If it is somebody from the royal family, Abdelaziz bin Salman, then it could be that there would be tension within the family, which would create problems within the country, definitely. That's the kind of issues. We don't know how much money is being spent on Yemen and all the new adventures of the Saudi young leadership in the region. So that also could create some problems as well. So I don't know where it's going to go. I think the Saudis will manage. I think Ali Al-Naimi will continue for the time being. I think ultimately the tensions within the family, if he was replaced by a son of Salman, would be too strong, and he would have to be, I think, in fact, they will continue to have a commoner in charge at the ministry. So I'm not overly worried, but I'm not 100% sure of what I'm advancing today. So we'll see. I was one of the very few who actually gave a price of oil. I said, and we're taking bets at the end of the day, right?
I've taken it.
Yes, that's right.
80, you bet 80?
80. So I was saying, if my little theory on the Russians is right, then the price will be at 80 by September. So you can
take it.
You cannot quote me on that. Thank you.
That's it.
Famous last words. You cannot quote him on that. Thank you, Jean-François. Now I will turn it over to Ambassador Wisner for the final summary of our remarks, and then we'll go to questions. Please, Ambassador Wisner.
Steve, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you and with the panel that you've just heard from. I think all of us came away today with at least one conclusion, and that is we've entered a new oil marketplace. That's something we've never known in the past, and we don't yet know where it is going to be and what price levels will be reached, but we are faced with a fundamentally new market that will affect profoundly the course of the region, our own interests in the world. And it is a subject to which I suggest we will all return on many occasions. As I thought about the consequences of a fundamentally new market, I was struck by the fact that over the past year and a half, couple of years, I've heard, as all of you have, many Americans idly commenting that somehow the good fortune of our shale revolution had removed from the obligations of the United States involvement in the Middle East, that somehow we were getting a free pass and were able to conduct our national affairs with less dependence on the Middle East. I never believed that argument, and I would be very surprised that anyone in this room believes we are free of the Middle East or should be. But what is absolutely clear is the shale revolution has given us two huge advantages. The first advantage is that it has contributed significantly to our own economic recovery and economic strengthening, and that translates directly into our capacities to conduct a sensible and robust foreign policy. And second, the shale revolution has created a sense of mobility. We are less bound by old problems and are able to be free to address in new and more novel, more imaginative ways the issues of this region. So as I look at the region, there is very little else to say than to conclude that in the Middle East today, there is no set of relationships the United States enjoys that is more important than the ties we have with the Gulf Arab states and, of course, across to Iran. But the Gulf Arab states in particular was the focus of our thinking today. We know from our experience the past ties we have had to the Gulf. We've known of our huge defense sales, our commitment to the security of the Gulf, the fact we went to war over Kuwait, the very fact of oil dependence that fuels the international economy. We've seen terrific markets for American technology, goods, services, and thousands of students that have come to the Gulf. But I would suggest those are all curtain raisers as to where the relationship stands today. For today, particularly since 2010 and the advent of the Arab Spring, if you will, we have seen a considerable change in the profile of the United States relationship with the Gulf Arab states. For after all, let's think about it, what is the only part of the Arab world that's weathered the storm of the crises that have toppled governments and created enormous chaos? It's been the Gulf. The Gulf has had the resources to become extremely influential in virtually every crisis or quarrel throughout the Arab world. And if the United States is to have any diplomatic effect, any ability to shape the course of events in the region, then we must be in harmony with the Gulf. That's extraordinary. We've never been in this position before. And it's perhaps particularly striking as we're not very far away from May 14, when the President receives at Camp David the leaders of the Gulf. And they'll have a lot to talk about. At heart, they have to overcome a deficit of confidence, one with the other. They've got to talk about the crises in Yemen, Syria, Libya, all those roiling crises that escape our ability to manage at the moment. That's important. There's the question of Egypt. How do we and the Gulf nations cooperate in maintaining Egypt's return to stability and build a new national consensus and fight the war on terror? And then there's the question of ISIS. The Gulf plays an immediate and direct role in what will happen in Iraq and how you delegitimize the language of ISIS. But most important of all, the President and his Gulf colleagues is going to have to talk about Iran and the possibility of an agreement between the P5+1 and Iran by the end of June. That agreement, we all know, and the Gulf knows, is very important for three reasons. The first is we cannot afford to have another war in the region. It will be destructive for all of us. Second, a region that cannot control its nuclear developments is going to be a region of serious proliferation. But third is the challenge, and the most important of all for our relationship with the Gulf, of how we and the Gulf and Iran think together about a security architecture for the region based on a balance of power that begins to reduce the tensions in the area, that stops the proxy fueling of proxy conflicts, and begins to find a new way. No greater challenge, will I argue, exists for American diplomacy today, nor looms larger on the Gulf American agenda. So I will argue with you that the relationship that has emerged with the Gulf is of huge importance to all of us. But we must warn ourselves, you can't take it for granted. No relationship that is taken for granted will survive. No relationship that does not permit the deep understanding of what motivates both parties and provides an ability to accommodate will survive. And that's where this institution fits in. What Marcel, Steve, and their team have put together is the beginning of a very clear-eyed focus on the dynamics of the Gulf and the Gulf-American relationship and the Gulf's reach into the Arab region. Through the publications that you will see on the table beside you in this inaugural session of discussion of an ambassadors forum, of the appearance of experts like our new senior fellow Hussein Ibish on television and radio, and other members of this staff, and looking to the future fellowships, internships in which people from the Gulf can come and work in Washington, all directed at a core purpose. And that purpose is to intensify the way we and the nations of the Gulf work together, think about one another. So let me invite you to future sessions. We intend to make a contribution to the policy dialogue in this, in this city when it comes to a matter as important as U.S. relations with the Gulf Arab states. I will close with just one note, and that is a recognition of a very special person in this room, Abdulmonem Said. Abdulmonem, it is an extraordinary honor to have you with us. You are the inspiration for this institute. From the perspectives that you've brought over your life to endow the Arab world with an analytical ability to understand what are the motor forces in Arab life, Arab politics, Arab security, and your dedication at the same time to building bridges between the Arab world and the United States. It's you who dreamed of this institution. It's you who persuaded its leadership to take their offices, and you will remain with us as our guide and inspiration. So I want to say particularly thank you. We're all proud to be in your presence.
Thank you so much for those words, Frank. We really appreciate it, and I think everyone can appreciate as well what an important moment this is for us as a startup organization to have this caliber of guests and panelists here with us today. Really does mean a great deal, and I think sets a tone and a bar quite high for us, and we certainly hope we can achieve these kind of results in the future. Now, let me turn, if I may, to your questions. I have Justin with a microphone. I have Alec with a microphone. Please, if you'd identify yourself and if you don't mind standing up so we can see you, that'd be helpful too. Justin, please. I think you have something right there.
Thank you. Mark Katz from George Mason University. My question is for Jean-François. Very interesting discussion of Saudi motives with regard to Russia, or maybe not. In your discussion of it, you indicated that if there is a Saudi policy toward Russia, it has to do solely with economic, with oil pricing issues. To read the Russian press, the Russian view, of course, is that Saudi policy is in response to political concerns, that the Saudis are punishing them for their policy in Syria, with regard to Iran, and hopes to bring about some change. And so I'm just curious as to how you feel this. Is there any political motive with regard to Saudi actions, or is it really just purely economic? Thank you.
Do you want me to?
Please, if you would. Yeah, well, that was Victor.
The answer, Mark, is the answer is I don't know. I wish I did know. I quite honestly, I think this is if it is a policy, I think it's a policy that is coming from the Ministry of Oil, not necessarily from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm sorry to say that I'm not sure the Saudis have a Ministry of Foreign Affairs these days, and I think in fact it is an economic policy. Now it so happens that it's proving a point, on Syria, but I think that's more incidental than a cause of the policy.
Thank you, Jean-François. Any more questions? I see a hand, Alec, right in front of you.
Thank you. Hi there. Afshin Malabi from Johns Hopkins SAIS. Congratulations to you on the opening of the Institute. I wish you well. I'd like to turn to Roger and maybe Jean-François as well on the issue of shale. Certainly, there are companies that have proven that they can survive at these prices of shale, but isn't the whole point that the new shale producers are afraid to enter the market at these prices? And the second point, which is probably the larger fear in the Gulf states, is that when China turns to shale, and these prices mean that China is not going to turn to shale anytime soon. So your thoughts on that?
Right. Shale is really a U.S. phenomenon, and I will describe that a little bit. Look, lower prices will have an impact on the sector. It's going to cause pain. What's been interesting is that the drop in cost is happening almost as fast, so it's allowing some of the producer to stay afloat. But when you look at a cost curve of all the wells drilled in 2013 or 2014, you have maybe 30% plus wells which needed $90 and more to be economic. So you're going to see a lot of these wells not being drilled. And in many ways, the way I describe the system has a lot of fat in it because we had very high prices. And what this downturn is going to do is going to remove the fat and add muscle. And this is what's going to happen in the system. The capital is going to flow to the most efficient, to the better acreage, to the better company. And the capital markets are fairly efficient for that. So we're going to see company going bankrupt. We're going to see lower activity. But at the end of the day, what you're going to have is overall that cost curve going down, the technological barrier being broken, and we see that every day. And the rate of change is really what's important here. Is what we see is the adaptation of the system is quite incredible, and what EOG was showing this morning was an illustration of that. On your broader issue about shale in the U.S. versus shale in the rest of the world, just to give you a little statistics, we have drilled in the last 5 years 800 shale wells outside of the United States. Last year, we have drilled 43,000 wells in the United States. The previous year, we had drilled 39,000 wells. This year, probably we'll drill 27,000 wells in the United States. So in terms of where the shale is globally versus where it is in the United States, there's no comparison. And obviously, that further increase that distance, that lower oil prices. But I don't think we were believing that we will see any shale production in anywhere else than the United States in the next 10 years. And there's many, many reasons for it. For shale to work, it requires a lot of ingredients to put together to make it take. And it's not, you're not baking a cake, you're really trying to put a souffle together. So if you don't put them in the right proportion, the right order, and the right temperature, it's not going to work. The most important one is the private ownership of the land. The second one is the availability of risk capital. The third one is the availability of the service companies, the equipment. And most importantly is who's involved. And when you look at international shale, which companies are involved, Conoco and Exxon in Poland, well, they haven't been that successful here. Other companies in China, not very successful, Shell in particular. So the shale players, the U.S. independent, are not going abroad. They're staying in the United States because the size of the prize here is such there's no reason to get a passport and go anywhere else. So it's not happening for many, many reasons. Finally, when you look at the resource pyramid, there's no reason to go drill for shale anywhere else in the world. There's plenty of resources which are not accessible right now. They could be accessible with conventional resources with better terms, access to capital, et cetera, et cetera. So the reason why we're drilling shale in the United States is because we run off all other options. And there's many better options in the rest of the world to drill than shales. It's really the worst part of the rock that we're trying to get oil from. So I don't think, thinking how shale is going to be exported. The question is, how do you fix the international system to produce more oil? After all, 75% of the reserve are in a handful of countries. And if you look at how much they're producing versus how much we're producing in the United States, we're really underproducing the rest of the world compared to the resources. So the question is, can we fix that part of the equation to meet the future need, or we won't be able to, and we're going to keep to access worse and worse resources in a way we have abandoned the rent and giving it to U.S. capitalist companies who have been able to take advantage of it.
Yeah, just maybe a quick addition to this, because it's very much in line with what Roger just said. I think the technology is changing so fast, though, that some of the issues might come up to the fore. The Chinese, for instance, as we all know, is supposed to have huge shale reserves, but they don't have any of the ingredients to the souffle, which Roger mentioned. However, technology is changing rapidly. And there is now very strong technologies on drilling for shale without water or with limited amount of water. And that could make a big, big difference for countries like China, or even for Saudi Arabia in the north, where they are thinking of drilling there. So you still have all the issues of land ownership and things of this nature, but it could change the equation a little faster than the 10 years Roger mentioned. But yeah, I'm not much of an engineer. So.
Let me add a little bit. I'll tell you a story on Chinese shale. Yeah. First, every shale is different. So what you learn in the Permian doesn't mean that it works in the Bakken or the Eagle Ford, and even less in China. But I went to China to check the shales. Mm-hmm. And we took a trip with a number of colleagues. And so we flew to Xi'an, and then we took a minibus to get to a frac job in the mountains of Xi'an. And it was a 6-hour drive. And we drove 5 hours. And the last hour were a very mountainous road, which was wide from here to here, really. So it was a one-track road with valleys on both sides. And we climbed for an hour, and then we were stopped because ahead of us there were like 20 trucks stopped. And so we went out of our minibus and we walked to the front of the line, and it was 20 frac trucks going up, and in front of them there were 20 frac trucks going down. Okay, and we said, well, how are you going to resolve this? Because we need to get it to the top of the mountain next hour. Say, well, we've been here for 6 days, so it's not going to be resolved anytime soon. And so why have we been here for 6 days? So because the villagers are fed up of us using the roads, and they block the roads, and they block the only place where the 2 frac truck can cross, and they don't want to let go. And we tried to bribe them, and we couldn't. And the police, the local police, which you imagine the Chinese Communist Party willing to solve the problem and let the truck go, were in the middle, and were all villagers too, and they were fed up of these trucks using the roads. So even in a system like China, and when you have the a policy will to move the ball, it's very, very difficult to make it happen on the ground.
Great, thank you very much. I think we have a question back right here. Justin's already there, please.
Judith Yaffe, and I'm a non-resident fellow here, as well as a few other things, but that's beside the point. I want to take exception to something Frank said, and since Mark has opened the door to pet rock questions, I want to ask about Iraq and the GCC, because to me, this is one of the things that has been neglected for a very long time, and I'm worried that the Gulf states may have missed a window of opportunity. But my question is, where will they fit in? You have Iraq, Iran, the GCC, and this so-called balance of power. And quite frankly, I don't like the term balance of power. I think it's old stuff. And we need to find a different term, because they are going to have to work out some kind of a different solution. So I'm wondering what your views are, and whoever wants to answer, I'm not really sure who the person is who really wants to take
Well,
this.
maybe I'll let Frank start. So you took exception to his remarks, so we'll go there first, Judith,
That's
okay?
wonderful, thank you.
Steve, I think you've discovered in me a robust defender of the concept of balance of power. But old stuff, new stuff, leave it aside for a second. What I think we're looking at in the Gulf is an extraordinary challenge. The Gulf, I'll never argue, was a meeting point in the world in which everyone loved everyone else, but there was a modus vivendi. That began to break down, however you want to count it, starting in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution, and it has only accelerated as the Arab Spring came into effect. It's touched on as well in the region by the Turks watching Iranian power expand. All of these complexities means that the peace and order of the region, as roughly that can be described, has gotten way out of kilter. And in addition to the dissidents caused by religious extremism, tribal animosities, ethnic differences, we now have this ghastly problem of proxies. So how do you begin to get your mind around the diplomatic challenge of bringing order back to this very troubled region? And I want to argue with you that the concept of finding a way in which each state in the area can live with the other without feeling that it is being overwhelmed, and that any hegemonic attempt by a single state will bring a coalition of response. In this framework, the United States can play an extraordinarily important role. We can find ourselves trying to encourage the strengthening of Iraq in combination with parties in the region, including in Iran, or opposing an Iran in a Yemen, but to use our influence to keep the equilibrium. I'll call it a balance of power. So I believe that is fundamentally a diplomatic challenge for the United States, and a way to begin to deconstruct the violence that we're faced with, to aim, not that we'll get there quickly, but if we don't know where we're trying to go, we'll not get there. So the nuclear agreement with Iran is simply stated, it has all its own internal logic, but it sets a stage in which we can begin to deal with Iran and bring Iran into the equation, to use the incentives and the disincentives of a different relationship with Iran to help restore this balance. That's my logic.
I'm going to ask Kamel for his views on this, please.
Yeah, thank you. I think we are maybe we are putting too much expectations from the forthcoming visit with President Obama in Camp David. I think there are too many issues to be tackled. Frankly, I cannot quite understand. There is a generation gap to start with between the leaders of GCC and Obama's administration and President Obama. How you gonna solve that generation gap in terms of attitude, in terms of openness, in terms of transparency? So that's one issue. And then we have, I don't know, we have created this mistrust now that America now no more dependent on our oil. They are becoming more independent, and here at the same time are siding or agreeing with Iran. And then we would be asking Iran not to interfere in Iraq, in Syria, in Gaza, in Yemen. And then what are we going to pay? Is there any price from GCC countries to pay to Iran in order to accommodate us or to accommodate Iran? So I think it's just too much complications and too much asking from USA. We, GCC, asking from USA and asking from Iran.
All right, thank you. Justin, I think we're up against the wall. We have a question here, please, then we'll come back to Judith in a minute.
I just have a question for Vinod with regard to, this is very fascinating. I read your paper before, but one of the, how would you see the balance sheet of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states over the next 5 years versus what you have seen the prior 5 years? And do you see any reason to believe that that is not going to be an instrument for survival? And the second and most important thing, I think I refer to what Kamel mentioned at the beginning, is do you see also some sort of economic, social changes that will impact these nations 5-10 years from now?
Well, I merely summarized some of this, so even though I like to answer a lot of questions, I'm not going to answer those because I think I'll defer to the panelists. So who would like to take up those two questions? I'm happy to talk about other issues, but not these particular ones when they're more experts here than me.
I mean, the first one is, lower oil prices mean that they're going to have to draw down some of these reserves. The question is how much. Obviously, they have a lot of capabilities for that. So how long can lower oil prices be there, and how long it will take them to bring down also the cost of running the countries? So does Saudi Arabia really need $100, or by streamlining some expenditure, it can live with 80, 85 or lower? One of the fascinating discussion I had with some of my Saudi colleagues was, okay, 115 was a mistake. We need to live in a lower oil environment, but analysts don't get it because they say, hey, oil prices are 50, you need 80. Well, we need 80 on average over the cycle, which means 5-7 years. And if we average that price over the cycle, we're fine. And by the way, the first 3 years of a cycle were 115, so you can make your own judgment of what the next 4 need to average to be fine. So I think their view is on longer term, and they understand that oil markets are very cyclical and nothing is permanent, and certainly not lower oil prices, because lower oil prices will create their own problems. And we can't, oil market cannot survive without Saudi Arabia. We need 8-10 million barrels per day coming from Saudi Arabia. The danger for them, not in the near term, but in the medium term, 5, 7, 8 years, is how to avoid $150 oil rather than avoid $50 oil. I think they understand that, and financially it's manageable. Obviously things happen. We can't predict everything. I mean, the question of Afshin is what happens if we have shale other places and prices stay low? I don't think that's on the horizon, but they're going to have to manage their budget over longer term and deal with the volatility of oil prices by keeping their spending reasonable and at a certain level. The second question I won't touch.
No, I wanted to add something.
On that,
Wait, what was the second question? Sorry. Well, what I wanted to say is I think
any question. What is that?
Saudi Arabia. Yeah, sorry. What was the second question?
What are the changes that's going to happen in the social and economic outlook
Yeah.
for those countries?
Okay. Well, I mean, if you talk to the Saudis, they are in this. It's a long-term game. It's short-term pain, they think, or even a few years of pain for long-term gain. I think they are aware of the fact that, somebody mentioned Iraq. Iraq is not going to be producing 9 million barrels a day by 2020. If they do 6 million, they're lucky. Probably more like 4.5. So I think the Saudis realize that. And in fact, when I was in Riyadh a few years ago, somebody said, the Iraqis want to do in 7 years what it took Aramco 70 years to do, and they don't have an Aramco there. So I think there were high expectations. Iraq is still going to be the biggest addition to supply in the future. But in terms of Saudi Arabia, I think the biggest danger is the subsidies, or there is no price reform. There isn't going to be price reform. They're trying to cut back on consumption through conservation efforts. It's having some impact, but at the same time, you see record growth in their production, but at the same time, their exports are falling because of rising consumption. They are exporting more products, so I think there is a shift. But, again, you need to. It's the problem of diversifying the economy so that you can get jobs for the youth and stop them going to fight with ISIS. And I mean, I was in Saudi Arabia recently. Others just come from Saudi Arabia. There is now a threat from the situation in Yemen, ricocheting back. So we're seeing added security, threats to shopping malls, to oil installations. So I think that's a new element that is frightening. So I think they are aware that they are really the only game in town at the moment, and that's given them. And there is an energy. I mean, when I was there, I realized, I noticed that there was a new energy in Saudi politics with the new king, even though he's quite old. People are quite happy that there is a more assertive policy, that he is actually speaking to the people, as they told me. So I think there is, we haven't had the destabilization that people expected from the death of a king and the succession. How long it will last, this love affair with the new king, I don't know, but there is certainly more energy in Saudi politics. So for now, it looks pretty stable. Kuwait, nothing is happening. I mean, in your country, the parliament, government, they're always arguing. So we're not seeing any increase in production from there. The UAE, yes, stable, a little bit of increased production. Iran may or may not come back, but it's going to take years for them to find investment. So I think the Saudis are still the biggest game in town, and that's why they can direct policy. And so long as they can maintain stability. But I think, the Yemen situation hasn't played out. There's no exit strategy yet, and I think that may be one of the biggest risks, in addition to Islamic State in Iraq.
Great, thank you, Kate. I think Jean-François has something to say.
Just a short comment on your basically socio-political question. I think one of the key issues in Saudi Arabia, it's not an issue, but one of the key changes that's taking place now is generational. I think the young folks, below the age of 30, are really becoming very important in Saudi Arabia. And I'm talking about the leaders, the people who've been to school. We know we have, 120,000 Saudi students here. And those people are coming back. And they started coming back, 5-10 years ago, and they're getting to be in positions of importance in the economy and in the government, but mostly in the economy. I think we're seeing an enormous development of the industrial power of Saudi Arabia. I was just mentioning earlier that today, if you take the chemical companies of Saudi Arabia, the balance sheets show that in 2014, they earned well, they didn't earn, they sold $86 billion worth of goods, which is the Saudi oil sales in 2003 or so. So, and these are managed by very young folks who are really pushing. Now, of course, the big change is that this $86 billion goes to the people, not to the state. And there is no tax. So the state gets nothing out of this, or very little. And so we'll see how that develops. But I think this young blood is really coming forth in a very big way. And I'm not sure where it's going to go, how far it's going to go, but it's here.
Okay, we have a question right here in the front row and then one in the third row, please. Justin, right here with Judith Kipper, if you would, please.
Thank you, Steve. I want to address my question to Roger, but I would make a cautionary point before that. I don't think I heard any of the panel use the word development. I think we know that the region is going through a monumental historic change that's probably going to take at least a century to sort itself out, and we'll long be gone by the time it does. And I would refer you to read again and to remember the UN Arab Gulf development reports, governance, women, economy, education, blah, 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 and the half-page summary at the end that said if they don't reform, things will blow sky high, and sure enough, they did. The Gulf states have been immune from it so far, but I don't think they can continue to be. It won't take the same form, but there will be some kind of disruptions over a period of time. Now, for Roger, obviously, oil fuels the global economy continuously. But it's one of the issues of global energy security. So I'd like to ask you, in the next 10 to 15 years, what would you say are the 3, 4, 5 major trends that you see, both good and bad, that are going to affect this global energy security, including the fact that UAE and maybe Saudi are going for nuclear energy? Because the long term, and that's not really long, 10 or 15 years, it's really between today and tomorrow, is far more important than the day-to-day excitement of oil prices or what ISIS did today or yesterday.
Actually, we're in the middle of an energy crisis, but not the one we expected. We have too much oil, we have too much gas, we have too much coal. Oil prices are down. So in a way, the challenge we're going to have is in the next 5 to 7 years is how do we continue to invest in all these resources, knowing that we have too much supply, not only in the United States, but we have too much gas in Australia and too much gas in Mozambique and too much oil in Brazil, et cetera, too much oil in Canada. So the biggest challenge for energy is really how to deal with that abundance with the climate change issue. And this is really what's impactful is oil companies, government, et cetera, are in a serious negotiation discussion. I mean, it's after all, it's the main goal of our president here is to deal with this issue of climate change. And you have a big meeting in Paris later in the year, actually. And these issues of sustainability, who's paying for what energy is going to be used, I think is the major debate of the time, and it's there for some time. Obviously, renewables are getting into the equation, and the ability to develop fast or not that fast, solar in particular, is a key issue. So it's really that nexus between what do we do with all the energy, what mix we're going to use, and how do we make it fit in order not to destroy the planet. That's a big politics of energy going forward. Then the Middle East fit into another bucket, if you want, because most of the oil reserves are still in the Middle East. And the stability in the region is important to make oil, to deal with oil and oil prices and oil volatility. And as you said, the region is not particularly entering an era of stability and is going to last. And how that's going to marginalize that fuel or not is going to be interesting. The last one is really around efficiency and demand. The question is, we have all these forecasts for very, steep increase in energy demand, and here my colleague Aldo can also answer that. There's a lot of uncertainty of how demand is going to evolve, and in particular how much efficiency is going to gain and reduce that growth rate and potentially peak for certain fuel. So I think there's major geopolitical discussion around or impact around these questions, difficult to assess at this time. But for me, what's interesting is the fact that energy is cheap at a time when we need to reduce its use for climate reason, and putting these two together is not very easy.
Great. Thank you very much. We have a question in the third row, right here. And then we'll go over to somewhere towards where Alec is, okay?
Bob Swarb, Institute of Economic Affairs in London. An old friend of mine asked me to come here today for this event, and I'm quite glad I did, because it's been a stimulating discussion. So thank you to the panel for that. A comment and a question. So my comment would be, Ambassador Wisner talked a little bit about how he felt this institute really needed to make sure that nobody in this room ever thought that the US could read isolationism. I would say that in many ways, that's probably one of the prime goals of this institute. Because if I look around, one of the interesting consequences of the shale revolution is that very similar to natural gas, you may know the dynamic, where actually companies find they have a cost advantage compared to the rest of the world. And therefore, they actually fight to keep that cost advantage. If you look at natural gas, for example, you actually have a huge dichotomy between natural gas prices in the US and, say, in Europe, for example, precisely because it's actually very hard to export natural gas, partly for technological reasons, infrastructure investment, but also because of lobbying. And I think that will be a natural challenge when oil is the price it's at, particularly, especially when you look at the other energy companies around the world, where very often, because they've taken on lots of dollar-denominated debt, they actually are in much deeper trouble.
You got to the question?
Yeah. My question really is very simple, which is, it goes back to the point somebody mentioned about, with Aggarwal, about the social break-even. Given the social break-even is so high, the implications of this really are twofold. One is, I'd be interested in the panel's views on what does this really mean for taxation and the evolution of the welfare state in the Arab world. In particular, they cannot rely on a subsidy model anymore. Secondly, what I'm interested in is, it also opens the question as to what the purpose of a sovereign wealth fund really is. Because many of them are right now caught between a rock and a hard place, where on one hand they're supposed to be investing with a view to growing the economy and diversifying it. At the same time, they're also perceived increasingly as the cash piggy bank in moments like this for money to draw down on.
Okay, thank you. Did that go to, Vinny, did that go to you?
I don't think that was to me, because
okay, that's fine.
I'm not trying to not answer questions. I'd like to look at the panel.
I think Kamel's going to take a stab at it. Okay. With your microphone, please, Kamel.
Sure. No. Let me just say about the sovereign wealth state, the sovereign wealth and the investment. By the way, Kuwait was the first one in 66 that we invested in UK. And we bought a property in UK, and then we bought another property in France, in the Champs-Élysées area. So we were the first one to invest, and it was very successful. And today we have a wealth of around $500 billion, and that is going to last us for 3 years. But I do agree with you, and this is what I've been saying, is that, but what is the use of it? we need, GCC needs, the country needs, Saudi Arabia needs jobs. And to invest, whether I invest in America or in Europe or whatever it is, it's fine. But that doesn't give me a job opportunity. Whether if I invest in ExxonMobil or in Dow Chemical, they will not recruit Kuwaitis or Saudis or Abu Dhabians. And this is the core. We have to create the jobs. And our population is very young. It's more than 50%, in the range of 25. And this is what we need. And this is our concern. I know that, as I said, it could be this excess monies that we have. It will last us the 3 years to come at oil price is 65. And then what? And this is why we have to address the cost cutting, the reduction, the subsidies. But there is a conflict within the government. How can we address it? How can we talk to people? How can we be transparent? And that's a challenge. And it is not only in Kuwait, it's also in Saudi Arabia. And it is very difficult to go and convince the population, to convince the people, saying now it is time that we reduce subsidies. And then the answer will be, what do you mean reducing subsidies? The oil prices are coming down. Everybody's reducing it. How come you're increasing on us? And this is why we also address the question. They always ask me, why you want the oil prices to come down? My answer to them is very, very simple. But what have we done with the $100 a barrel oil? Thank you.
I'm going to go to the back if I can. Al, you got someone close to you? All right, there's a hand. Yeah, and then we'll go over here to Alan.
Great. Hi, I'm Nate Hodson, Princeton University. I have two quick questions. The first is for Kate. You said that at some point Saudi Arabia will have to step in to balance the market because it won't balance itself. I was just wondering if you could explain what you meant by that and why that's the case. And then the second quick question is, I suppose probably sort of, oh, it's not on. Okay.
We hear you.
Now it's on. Should I repeat? You got the first one, right? Yeah. Okay. And then the second question is probably for Roger and maybe Jean-François, is in advance of the Saudi decision not to cut production, why didn't they play any financial games with markets themselves? Why didn't they short oil? Was it for political reasons? I don't know the legal intricacies of commodities trading. But in some ways, they didn't even make a decision, right? It was simply to maintain the status quo, but I'm curious about that. Thanks.
As far as I know, they never actually play the market. I think Kuwait used to in the old days, but the Saudis never have done. I think they're trying to find a face-saving way of doing it, which is why they're talking to the Russians. I think they sort of painted themselves into a corner. I think Naimi can't back down now on, having said it doesn't really matter if prices go down to 20. But I think the Yemen adventure is going to add to their costs. I think as they look at their you've got a new team. How much support Naimi has, I don't know. Obviously, the policy came from the top. Naimi didn't go out and say, okay, I'm going to blow 150 billion. He was supported by King Salman. But there's a new team in town. There is a new, it's changing all the time. But I also think that they're trying to find a face-saving way of at least trying to do something. Because at the moment, if you look at OPEC, they're all producing at maximum capacity, so that if a cut comes, it's going to come from a higher level, which is why we're seeing these, according to our estimates, they're producing over 31 million. Others have them close to 30 million. So they're sort of... 31 million. Others have them close to 31. So they are overproducing at the moment, and I think everybody is pumping to capacity so that when the cut comes, and it'll come from actual production, everybody will say, hey, hang on, we're producing 3.2, so we have to cut from that level. So I think the next meeting is going to be interesting. It's going to come before the agreement with Iran. So I think the Saudis are maybe trying to, they say to me all the time, the Russians have to play ball. And I say to them, but the Russians can't do anything because it's very difficult for them to shut down and start again. They have problems. So I think they're maybe trying to find a formula where they cut a little bit. It'll have psychological impact on the market, but not so much impact their market share.
If I would like to, look, oil market are complicated in the sense that you have a lot of variability during the year for demand. You have seasonality. And as I said, very small change in supply have dramatic implication on prices. So if you look at the history of oil, you always had somebody trying to manage the market, being Rockefeller, the Texas Railroad Commission, or OPEC, or Saudi Arabia. The reason is you need to help balance the market some way or another. It's not perfect, but building stocks and moving large volume of oil and to store it doesn't make sense. So otherwise, we're going to have to shut down the wells. So the market needs some sort of management. And if Saudi Arabia, by signaling that there will not be that manager, even on a seasonal basis, which is really revolutionary as a concept, and I'll explain in a minute in numbers, mean that suddenly price is going to have to swing quite a lot to force other producer, high-cost producer, to do the swing. Between December and March, oil demand goes down by something like 3 million barrels per day. If nobody is managing that swing over those 4 months, you build massive stocks during the year. Okay? And then it's not clear that, by the second half of the year, you'll draw them down too fast or too slow. I mean, you might end up in August with not enough oil if Saudi Arabia is always producing at the same level. And Saudi Arabia has been, and the other Gulf producer, pretty good at trying to manage these wrinkles, if you want, in the demand side. And by not doing that, suddenly, it creates a lot of volatility and a lot of uncertainty. And in that sense, I don't think it's sustainable that in the long term, I don't know when is that you don't have a manager. So the question, who's the manager? Right now, we have appointed as manager Wall Street. So we're counting on Wall Street discipline, don't laugh, to manage oil prices. So that's quite exceptional. We're in a void which didn't exist before. And you know, that's one of the issues. The other one is why Saudis don't play the market is you're asking the same question, why the Fed doesn't play the interest rate before they announce their decision. It's the same issue. If they do that, there's no oil market. I mean, it dies.
Jean-François, did you
Yeah, I totally agree with Roger on that. The Saudis have never played the market. They will never play the market. It's just not in the blood of the civil servants that are running these operations. They just will not do it.
The market. I mean, there will be no market.
Absolutely. One thing I'd just like to mention, because we talk a lot about it in theory, but we haven't talked about it today, is the fact that the oil is a very inelastic commodity. And we saw that you mentioned that there was an increase of production of 1.6%, and it brought down the price by 50%. So it could go the other way. And that's why I'm saying earlier, if the Russians agree to cut a little bit and the Saudis match that, the prices, there would be a reaction on prices. Now, we discussed this with Kate a bit earlier, and it's not automatic. Kate pointed to the fact that it all depends on whether the demand is there anyway. If there is any kind of demand and the supply declines a little bit, the prices could move substantially. We forget that sometimes, I think.
Great, thank you. Alec, up here in the third row, this young man with the blue tie.
Flattery won't get you anywhere. Thank you very much. I'm Alan Kieswetter of the Middle East Institute. Yes. I guess I have a question for Roger and maybe Jean-François. It occurs to me that the environmental issues have been underplayed in the discussion, and that this is the cloud on the future of shale. This is driven home a little bit by the article in the New York Times on Friday saying there had been more earthquakes in Oklahoma in the last 2 years than there had in the previous 2 decades. It would only take one major earthquake, and for the legal ramifications will greatly affect the financial markets and the whole public opinion. So is this possibly a little too positive view of the future of shale, that maybe environmental concerns are going to impinge rather sharply on the development of shale?
I think they'll impinge. I don't think they'll impinge sharply. And we see that. I mean, the standards for drilling, fracking, et cetera, are going to get tighter and tighter in the country, and the control of the emission. But I think the industry is ready for that. I don't think there will be a major impingement. I mean, after all, we're drilling again in the Gulf of Mexico. And we had a major catastrophe 5 years ago, almost to the day. So I think the standards will increase. It will create some problem and some increase in cost to the industry, but I think the industry can absorb it pretty well. The major impingement for the industry would be the ability or not to export oil. But more broadly, beyond the shale, I think there's a bigger issue rather than just the shale. Is really about carbon and, you know, how do you plateau and start reducing carbon emission. Those are bigger issues than just the shale, and those will impact the industry in the years to come.
And also, since we were talking about GCC, I mean, I live in Dubai, and if you see them zooming up and down the Sheikh Zayed Road, nobody really cares about the environment there. It's like, you know, petrol is cheap, it's subsidized. I fill up my car for, you know, $25 fills up my car.
Same here.
And there's a culture of waste. No, yes. But you don't have the gas guzzlers. So I think there's a culture of waste, and, you know, it really is not something that's very high on the agenda. And let's face it, you know, shale gas meant that you didn't need coal in the US, so you're shipping it to Europe, where they're burning it like there's no tomorrow because their gas is too expensive. So we just have to find the right balance in energy policy, and at the moment, I don't think the world's got that.
Any
Maybe
questions,
Paris.
any hands, please? And I want to thank very much all of our panelists for your, again, heroic efforts today. Thank you.